When Claire, a talented but overlooked product designer, creates a groundbreaking prototype, she believes her hard work will finally pay off. But her world shatters when her smooth-talking CEO, Greg, steals her idea, claims it as his own, and secures millions in funding, all while leaving her in the shadows. Devastated and betrayed, Claire quits, determined to leave the nightmare behind. But instead of moving on, Claire makes a bold decision: she'll fight back. Teaming up with a former colleague who's also been burned by Greg's schemes, Claire uncovers shocking truths about his empire: fraud, lies, and stolen ideas far worse than she imagined. Armed with evidence, they launch a plan to expose Greg, ruin his reputation, and dismantle his empire piece by piece. As Greg scrambles to protect himself, he threatens to expose a secret from Claire's past, one that could destroy her hard-earned credibility. Now, Claire faces a dangerous choice: risk everything by coming clean or let Greg manipulate her again. In a battle of wits, revenge, and justice, Claire must outsmart the man who underestimated her, and ensure he's brought down for good. This is a tale of betrayal, revenge, and the high-stakes fight for justice in the ruthless world of innovation. It's funny how the smallest moments can change everything. One day, you're just another cog in the corporate machine, grinding away to make someone else richer. The next, you're watching your entire world collapse under the weight of betrayal. For me, that moment happened in a sterile conference room with fluorescent lights that buzzed just loud enough to drive you insane. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'd been working at Crescent Technologies for 3 years when it happened. Fresh out of college, I was one of those bright-eyed, ambitious types who genuinely believed that hard work and talent would get me ahead. I didn't mind the long hours or the lack of work-life balance. I figured it was all part of the grind, the price you paid to make it big in the tech industry. Crescent wasn't Google or Apple, but it had potential. Greg Carmichael, our CEO, loved to call it the little startup that could. He had a way with words that made you believe in the vision, even when the reality was 12-hour workdays and no overtime pay. Greg was the kind of guy who could charm anyone. He had this infectious energy, always smiling, always talking about how Crescent was going to change the world. But beneath that veneer, there was something off about him. He had a way of making you feel like you owed him something, like every opportunity he gave you was a favor you could never repay. At the time, I didn't see it. I thought I was lucky to have a boss who believed in me. I spent most of my time in the product design department. There were only 4 of us, crammed into a tiny corner of the office with mismatched desks and chairs that squeaked every time you moved. But I didn't care. I loved my work. I loved creating things that could make people's lives better. And the project I was working on at the time? It was the most exciting thing I'd ever done. The idea had come to me during one of those late-night brainstorming sessions that happen when you're too tired to think straight. I wanted to create a device that could help people save energy without even thinking about it, a smart home system that learned your habits and adjusted automatically. It wasn't just another gadget, it was something that could genuinely make a difference. I poured my heart and soul into it. Nights, weekends, lunch breaks, it didn't matter. Every spare moment went into perfecting the design. When I finally had a working prototype, I felt like I was on top of the world. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the little device and thinking, this is it. This is the thing that's going to change everything. Greg must have noticed the change in me because he called me into his office that afternoon. "Claire," he said, flashing that $1 million smile, "you've been working like crazy lately. What's going on?" I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure if I should tell him. The prototype wasn't technically company property, not yet, anyway. But I'd been so eager for someone to see it, to validate all the effort I'd put in. So, I told him. I told him everything. About the sleepless nights, the endless tweaks, the vision I had for the product. His eyes lit up as I spoke, and for a moment, I thought he was genuinely impressed. "This is incredible," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You've got something big here, Claire. Something game-changing. Hearing those words felt like a dream. Greg was the kind of person who could open doors, who could turn ideas into reality. If he believed in my project, then maybe, just maybe, it could actually happen. Over the next few weeks, Greg took a sudden interest in my work. He asked for updates on the prototype almost daily, offering feedback and suggestions. At first, I was thrilled. It felt like all my hard work was finally paying off. He even hinted that he was pitching the idea to investors, saying things like, "The feedback's been great so far, and we're going to make waves with this." I hung on his every word, imagining the day we'd launch the product together, the day I'd finally get the recognition I'd been dreaming of. But then, things started to feel off. Greg stopped giving me updates about the investors. When I asked how things were going, he'd change the subject or brush me off with vague reassurances. "Don't worry about it," he'd say. "Just focus on refining the design." I didn't think much of it at first. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was the CEO, the one who'd always talked about how Crescent was a family, about how he wanted us all to succeed together. Then came the Monday morning meeting. I should have known something was up when Greg called the entire office into the conference room. He wasn't big on company-wide meetings, he preferred to let the managers handle that sort of thing. But that day, he was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. He stood at the front of the room, waiting for everyone to settle down, and then he dropped the bombshell. "I'm thrilled to announce that Crescent Technologies has just secured a $5 million investment for our latest innovation," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "This is going to be a game-changer for the industry." He paused for dramatic effect, then reached behind him and picked up my prototype. "This device," he said, holding it up for everyone to see, "is going to put Crescent on the map. And I couldn't be prouder to share it with you." The room erupted into applause. People were clapping, cheering, congratulating him. And I just sat there, frozen. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the sound of it. He didn't mention my name. Not once. He didn't even glance in my direction. It was like I didn't exist. When the meeting ended, I felt like I was in a daze. I walked straight to Greg's office, barely noticing the congratulations and back pats people were throwing his way. When I got there, I didn't bother knocking. I just walked in. "Greg," I said, my voice shaking, "what the hell was that?" He didn't even flinch. He just leaned back in his chair and smiled like nothing was wrong. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone as casual as if we were talking about the weather. "You know what I mean," I snapped. "That's my prototype. My idea. You didn't even mention me in the meeting." Greg sighed, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Claire, I get it. You're upset. But you need to understand how these things work. The prototype may have been your concept, but it was developed on company time. That makes it Crescent's intellectual property." I stared at him, stunned. "Are you serious right now? I worked on that project outside of office hours. That's my work. My design." He shrugged. "You're a valuable team member, Claire, but at the end of the day, this is business. You're still going to benefit from the success of the product. Everyone at Crescent will." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The way he was talking, it was like I should be thanking him for stealing my work. "Let it go," he said, his voice softening as if he were doing me a favor. "Focus on what's next. You've got a bright future here." Something inside me snapped. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out of his office. By the end of the day, I'd cleared out my desk and handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay there, not after what he'd done. I thought leaving would make me feel better, but it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. I spent weeks in a spiral of anger and self-pity, replaying that meeting over and over again in my head. Greg had taken everything I'd worked for and turned it into his personal victory. And there was nothing I could do about it. At least, that's what I thought at the time. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, walking out of Crescent Technologies with a box of my belongings and a heart full of rage, was the beginning of something much bigger. Greg thought he'd won. He thought I was just another cog he could replace. He had no idea what was coming. I spent the first few weeks after leaving Crescent Technologies in a haze of anger and helplessness. I'd gone from being someone on the verge of a breakthrough to being just another unemployed designer, scrolling through job boards with zero motivation. Every headline about Crescent's revolutionary new product felt like a personal attack. There was Greg's face plastered all over tech blogs, grinning like the smug thief he was. But it wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me, it was the doubt. What if Greg was right? What if I didn't stand a chance against someone like him? I'd spent my whole life believing that talent and hard work would be enough, but he'd proven how easily those things could be taken away. The thought of starting over, of clawing my way back from nothing, was almost too much to bear. I spent hours replaying that Monday morning meeting in my mind, imagining all the things I should have said. But every time I thought about confronting Greg again, the same fear stopped me cold. He was the CEO, and I was just me. How could I fight someone with that much power and influence? How could I even start? That question gnawed at me, keeping me up at night. But one sleepless evening, something shifted. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a new thought crept into my mind. You can't beat him by playing fair. But what if you didn't have to play fair? At first, the idea scared me. I wasn't the type of person who sought revenge, or so I told myself. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what Greg had done wasn't just unfair, it was criminal. He'd stolen my work, taken credit for my ideas, and used them to enrich himself. If I let him get away with it, I'd be telling the world, and myself, that he was right, that people like him always win. And I couldn't let that happen. The first step was figuring out exactly how Greg had pulled it off. I'd handed over my prototype and my trust, but I hadn't been completely blind. Over the months I'd worked on the device, I'd kept detailed notes, design specs, research data, even email chains where Greg had praised my progress. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I pulled out my laptop and started combing through everything, searching for any thread I could pull to unravel his scheme. That's when I remembered Hannah. Hannah had been one of my closest colleagues at Crescent before she'd left abruptly about 6 months before me. At the time, she told everyone she was leaving to pursue other opportunities, but there had always been something off about the way she said it. She'd been one of the most driven, talented people I'd ever worked with, and it didn't make sense for her to walk away so suddenly. I decided to reach out to her. It was a long shot, she hadn't been particularly active on social media, and I didn't have her personal number, but after some digging, I found her LinkedIn profile. I sent her a message, explaining what had happened with Greg and asking if we could talk. To my surprise, she replied almost immediately. I was wondering when someone else would figure him out, her message read. Let's meet. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in the city the next day. When I walked in, I spotted her right away. She hadn't changed much since I'd last seen her, though there was a sharpness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She waved me over, and I sat down, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. I was starting to think I was the only one, she said, skipping the pleasantries. So, tell me everything. I launched into the story, explaining how Greg had stolen my prototype and passed it off as his own. As I spoke, Hannah's expression shifted from understanding to outright anger. When I finished, she let out a bitter laugh. Classic Greg, she said. He did the same thing to me. I blinked. What? She nodded, her jaw tightening. I was working on a project, an AI-powered scheduling tool. It wasn't as flashy as your device, but it had potential. Greg showed a lot of interest in it, kept asking for updates, just like he did with you. Then one day, I walked into the office and saw him presenting my work to a group of investors. He didn't even try to hide it. When I confronted him, he gave me the same line, "It's company property." She shook her head. I quit that day. I felt a surge of anger, not just for myself, but for her. Greg hadn't just stolen from me, he'd made a habit of it. "Why didn't you do anything?" I asked. Hannah sighed. "I wanted to. But I didn't have the resources to fight him. I tried reaching out to lawyers, but without a paper trail proving that the idea was mine, there wasn't much they could do." "And Greg? He's careful. He knows how to cover his tracks." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. If Hannah hadn't been able to fight him, what chance did I have? But then, something clicked. "What if we work together?" I asked. "Between the two of us, we might have enough to take him down." Hannah hesitated, her fingers tapping against her coffee cup. "It's not just about evidence," she said. "Greg's got connections. Even if we prove what he did, he'll find a way to weasel out of it. He always does." "What if we didn't just expose him?" I said, my voice lowering. "What if we destroyed him?" She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, my heart racing. "We don't just go after the stolen ideas. We go after everything, his reputation, his investors, his company. We hit him where it hurts." For a long moment, Hannah didn't say anything. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "I'm listening." Over the next few weeks, Hannah and I worked in secret, piecing together a plan. It wasn't easy. Greg had been careful to keep his tracks covered, but between the two of us, we had enough insider knowledge to start connecting the dots. I provided the emails and design notes from my project, while Hannah dug up old records from her time at Crescent. What we found was worse than I'd expected. Greg wasn't just stealing ideas, he was committing outright fraud. He'd been inflating Crescent's revenue numbers to attract investors, fudging the details in ways that would be hard to spot unless you knew where to look. He'd also been cutting corners on product development, using cheaper materials that could potentially lead to safety issues down the line. The deeper we dug, the more skeletons we uncovered. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. If we wanted to bring Greg down, we needed to be strategic. Simply going to the authorities wouldn't cut it. Greg's lawyers would bury us in red tape before we even got a chance to present our case. Instead, we decided to take a different approach. We started by leaking anonymous tips to a journalist who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. We didn't give him everything, just enough to spark interest. Meanwhile, we began compiling a dossier of evidence to send to Crescent's investors. Our goal was simple: to make Greg look like a liability. If we could turn his investors against him, the rest of his empire would crumble. It was a risky plan, and there were moments when I doubted whether it would work. But every time I felt like giving up, I thought about that Monday morning meeting, about the way Greg had smiled as he held up my prototype. He thought he'd won. He thought I was just another pawn he could discard. He had no idea what was coming. As the plan began to take shape, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. Greg wasn't just a thief, he was a master manipulator, the kind of person who could turn a situation in his favor with nothing but a well-timed smile. But Hannah and I were determined. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was personal. Greg had built his success by crushing people like us, and we were going to make sure he paid for it. The first step of our plan was to expose Greg's lies to the media. Hannah and I had spent weeks collecting evidence, emails, financial records, and internal documents that painted a damning picture of how Greg had been operating Crescent Technologies. But instead of handing everything over at once, we decided to play the long game. We reached out anonymously to a journalist named Marcus Holt. Marcus was known for taking down shady CEOs, and his articles had exposed some of the biggest corporate scandals of the last decade. He was relentless and, more importantly, he had a reputation for protecting his sources. Our first email to him was short and cryptic. I have information about Crescent Technologies and its CEO, Greg Carmichael. He's committing fraud and stealing intellectual property. If you're interested, we'll send more details. We attached a single email chain as proof, just enough to get his attention. The subject line read, "Proof of corporate theft." Marcus responded within hours. "I'm listening. Send me what you've got." We didn't reply right away. Instead, we let him stew for a few days. It was part of the strategy, building suspense, making him want more. When we finally sent him a second batch of evidence, it was explosive, records showing how Greg had manipulated Crescent's financial reports to inflate their revenue. The next day, Marcus called me from an encrypted number. His voice was low and serious. "Who are you?" he asked. "And why are you coming forward now?" I kept my answers vague. "We're former employees," I said. "We can't give you our names, but we worked closely with Greg. He's been getting away with this for years, and it's time someone stopped him." Marcus was sharp, he tried to press for more details, but I stayed firm. We couldn't afford to reveal too much, not yet. "You'll have everything you need soon," I told him. "But you have to promise to keep our identities out of it." "Fair enough," he said. "But if what you're saying is true, this could be huge. I'm going to need more evidence before I can publish anything." "Don't worry," I said. "There's plenty more where that came from." While Marcus started digging into the story, Hannah and I focused on the second part of our plan, hitting Greg where it hurt the most, his investors. Crescent Technologies had built its reputation on innovation, and the investors backing the company had poured millions into Greg's vision. If we could convince them that Greg was a fraud, they'd pull their funding faster than he could spin a press release. This was where things got tricky. Investors didn't care about morality, they cared about results. We needed to show them that Greg wasn't just unethical, but that he was a financial liability. Hannah suggested starting with the biggest investor, a venture capital firm called Horizon Partners. Horizon had invested heavily in Crescent's latest product, the very one Greg had stolen from me, and they had a lot to lose if the company went under. We put together a package of evidence, carefully curated to highlight Greg's financial misconduct. It included spreadsheets showing how he'd inflated revenue numbers, as well as emails where he'd instructed his team to clean up discrepancies in the books. We even included a timeline of product failures that had been quietly swept under the rug. But we didn't send it directly to Horizon. Instead, we created a fake email account and posed as a concerned Crescent employee. The email was short and to the point. "I'm writing to inform you that Greg Carmichael has been falsifying financial records to secure investor funding. Attached, you'll find proof of his misconduct." As someone who's worked closely with him, I felt it was my duty to speak up before things spiral out of control. The email went out at midnight. By morning, we had our answer. Horizon Partners issued a public statement announcing that they were reevaluating their investment in Crescent Technologies due to recent allegations of financial irregularities. It was the first domino to fall. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, other investors started pulling their funding, and Crescent's stock value, already fragile due to its status as a startup, took a nosedive. Greg scrambled to contain the damage, issuing press releases and giving interviews where he denied the allegations and painted himself as the victim of a smear campaign. But then, Marcus's article dropped. The headline was bold and damning: "The Fraud Behind Crescent Technologies, How CEO Greg Carmichael Built an Empire on Lies." The article didn't just expose Greg's financial misconduct, it detailed everything, from the stolen ideas to the shortcuts he'd taken during product development. Marcus had done his homework, digging up interviews with former employees who confirmed Greg's pattern of theft and manipulation. He even quoted an anonymous source, me, who described how Greg had stolen my prototype. The article went viral within hours. Social media exploded with outrage, and tech forums lit up with debates about the ethics of the industry. Investors who hadn't already jumped ship began issuing statements distancing themselves from Crescent. The company was in free fall, and Greg's carefully constructed image was unraveling before his eyes. But we weren't done yet. With the media and investors turning against him, Greg was vulnerable. This was the moment we'd been waiting for, the moment to deliver the final blow. Hannah and I had been saving the most damning piece of evidence for last, proof that Greg had knowingly approved substandard materials for one of Crescent's earlier products, a smart thermostat that had been recalled due to safety concerns. The recall had been framed as a manufacturing error, but the internal documents told a different story. Greg had signed off on the cheaper materials to cut costs, despite warnings from the engineering team that it could lead to overheating. We sent the documents to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Within a week, they announced an investigation into Crescent Technologies for potential violations of safety regulations. The news was a death sentence for the company. As the investigation gained traction, Greg's remaining allies began to abandon him. Board members resigned, employees started leaking more stories to the press, and the lawsuits began piling up. By the time the dust settled, Crescent Technologies was in shambles, and Greg's reputation was beyond repair. But for me, the fight wasn't over. Watching Crescent crumble was satisfying, but it didn't erase what Greg had done. My prototype, the idea I'd poured my heart and soul into, was still out there, tangled in the wreckage of his lies. If I wanted to reclaim it, I'd have to take one more risk. I reached out to Marcus again, this time using my real name. "I want to go on the record," I said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once your name is out there, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I said. "People need to know the truth." And this time, I was ready to tell it. I thought going public would be the end of the fight, a final declaration of victory that would let me move on. When Marcus published my story, naming me as the true creator of the stolen prototype, it felt like I'd finally taken back a piece of what Greg had stolen. The headline read, "The Woman Behind the Idea, How Claire Exposed a Tech CEO's Web of Lies." The response was overwhelming. Overnight, I became something of a folk hero in the tech world, a symbol of resilience against corporate greed. My inbox flooded with emails from strangers congratulating me, sharing their own stories of workplace injustice, and offering support. It was everything I'd wanted for so long: recognition, validation, justice. But I underestimated one thing: Greg. It started with a phone call, 2 weeks after the article went live. I didn't recognize the number, but when I picked up, his voice hit me like a cold slap to the face. "Hello, Claire." I froze. I hadn't heard from Greg since the day I walked out of Crescent Technologies, and I hadn't expected to ever hear from him again. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I wanted to congratulate you," he said, his tone oozing with that infuriating smugness he always carried. "You've done well for yourself. Really turned this into a PR win." "What's your point, Greg?" He laughed, a low, condescending chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. "My point is that you've been basking in the spotlight, but you forgot one thing: this isn't over." I clenched my jaw, refusing to let him intimidate me. "You lost, Greg. The world knows what you are. Crescent is finished, and so are you." "Am I?" he asked, his voice calm and almost amused. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've got a bigger problem than me. I wonder how your adoring fans would react if they found out the whole truth about that prototype of yours." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "You think I didn't notice," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You were good, Claire. But not that good. That prototype of yours, it wasn't entirely yours, was it? A little borrowed code here, a little borrowed design there. Sound familiar?" I felt the blood drain from my face. The truth was, Greg wasn't entirely wrong. When I'd been developing the prototype, I'd pulled inspiration from everywhere: open source code repositories, early stage projects I'd worked on during college, even scraps of research left behind by former Crescent employees. At the time, it hadn't seemed like a big deal. The tech world was built on collaboration and iteration, no one created anything entirely from scratch. But now, in Greg's hands, that truth could be twisted into something much darker. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't play dumb, Claire," he said. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. I've still got access to the old Crescent archives, including a little design file you pulled from Hannah's work before she left. Remember that scheduling algorithm she developed? The one you borrowed for your prototype's machine learning system?" I went cold. He was bluffing. He had to be. "You're lying," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Am I?" he replied. "I've got the timestamps to prove it. Wouldn't it be ironic if the woman who brought me down turned out to be a thief herself? Imagine the headlines: 'The hero who lied, Claire's prototype wasn't her own.'" Panic set in, clawing at the edges of my mind. I hadn't stolen anything outright, I'd simply adapted pieces of pre-existing work. But in the court of public opinion, those nuances wouldn't matter. Greg knew that. "What do you want, Greg?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now we're getting somewhere," he said, his tone triumphant. "Here's the deal: you're going to release a statement saying you exaggerated your role in the prototype's development. Say it was a team effort, that Crescent deserves credit, and that the media blew everything out of proportion. Do that, and I'll keep my little discovery to myself. And if I don't?" He let out a long, satisfied sigh. "Then I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you are. You think they'll side with you after this? Good luck rebuilding your reputation when everyone sees you as a fraud." The line went dead. I sat there for hours, staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. If Greg went public with this, it would destroy everything I'd worked for. The press would tear me apart, and the tech community, so quick to crown me a hero, would turn on me in an instant. But the thought of bending to his will, of letting him manipulate me all over again, made me sick. I couldn't let him win. Not this time. That's when I realized there was only one way out. The next morning, I called Marcus. "There's something I didn't tell you," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Over the next hour, I laid everything out: the borrowed code, the adapted designs, the pieces of the prototype that weren't entirely mine. I told him about Greg's threats and how he planned to use the truth to destroy me. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. "You realize this could blow back on you, right?" he said finally. "Coming forward like this could ruin your reputation." "I know," I said. "But if I don't own it now, Greg will use it to bury me. At least this way, I control the narrative." Marcus sighed. "You're braver than most people I've met in your position. I'll write the story, but you need to be ready for the fallout." "I am," I said, though I wasn't sure it was true. The article went live 2 days later. The complicated truth behind Crescent's scandal, Claire's prototype and the gray area of innovation. It was a carefully crafted piece, balancing my admission of fault with an exploration of how the tech industry thrives on shared ideas. Marcus framed it as a larger conversation about ethics in innovation, highlighting how blurred the lines can become in a world where collaboration and competition coexist. The response was mixed. Some people praised my honesty, calling me brave for coming forward. Others called me a hypocrite and demanded I return the credit I'd received. My inbox was a war zone, filled with equal parts support and vitriol. But the most surprising reaction came from Hannah. She called me the night the article went live. "I read it," she said, her voice cautious. "You should have told me." "I'm sorry," I said. I didn't think. You used my work, Claire, she interrupted. Without asking. That's exactly what Greg did to us. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't mean to. But, she said, cutting me off again, you owned up to it. And that's more than Greg ever did. I'm still angry, but I respect that you came clean. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Don't thank me yet, she replied. Just, don't make the same mistake again. Greg, on the other hand, was furious. He'd lost his leverage, and with it, any hope of rebuilding his reputation. He tried to spin the story in his favor, claiming I was deflecting blame and painting myself as the victim, but no one was listening anymore. His credibility was gone, and every word he said only made him look more desperate. In the end, it wasn't a perfect victory. My name was tarnished, my reputation forever linked to a scandal I'd helped expose. But I was free. Free from Greg, free from the lies, and free to start over. And this time, I'd build something entirely my own.